And the overview of my lecture, I hope it will be entertaining and giving you some facts. Trotzdem, I will give you some ideas about the history of MDMA, especially also about the military and what they have done with MDMA. There are some rumors out there, but nobody knows the facts, so to say. And then there is the toxicity issue, which was a big issue, and a lot of rumors are around about that. And then there will be some remarks about MDMA and psychotherapy, and the end will be a hypothesis which we brought up in 2005 that the typical MDMA-induced state is equivalent to the post-orgasmic state. Everybody's talking about orgasm, but nobody about the post-orgasmic state. There's still virtually no research about that. When you are in paradise, you don't do research on that, right? Okay, why history? Yeah, one quote from a guy who has done a little bit of history about MDMA. And so it was necessary to really go deeper into these issues about the history. And so I will give you some flashlights, what happened it begins with rumors, because two rumors are out there about the very early history of MDMA. One is that Fritz Haber, some of you might know his name, he was the guy who got the Nobel Prize for ammonia synthesis. His wife was his fate, did suicide because she was in the peace movement and he was synthesizing gas warfare agents. And so they had not the best understanding. But Fritz Haber did a dissertation about the synthesis of some good smelling agents, one of them called heliotropin. And during these synthetic processes, when he tried to alter the heliotropin molecule, he came quite near to substances near to MDMA. And this made the rumor, but if you really look as a chemist at this dissertation, it's not in there. So he came close to it, but he did not synthesize it. Yeah, there's another rumor out there, I just have two. MDMA was produced as an appetite suppressing agent, an anorectic agent, as the Americans say. You could easily see that 1912, the people were hungry. They were not needing appetite suppressant agent, and it's simply not true. But a kind of near a substance, chemically somewhat, pharmacologically not as much, but chemically quite near to MDMA, has been tested as an anorectic agent in the 1950s in the US, and therefore there might be that connection to lead to that rumor. However, what was the real thing around it? It was a company, Merck, in Germany, and Merck was really into psychoactive drugs. They produced heroin, they produced cocaine, they produced mescaline, and they produced MDMA, not for the purpose as a drug and as a psychoactive agent. It was, the history took another turn. So there was a substance which has been used as a so-called blood clotting agent. For example, if women have quite a menstrual bleeding, you know, sometimes you have to give medications so that the blood is not as much going out as it is naturally the case, so to say. The same might happen after a birth, you know, and so they try to find agents which kind of bring the vessels a little bit smaller so that not so much blood is lost. And one of these substances, the most significant at the time, was hydrastinine. And that stems from a plant, but they tried to cultivate the plant, but that wasn't possible. But they needed more of that stuff. And what happened is they tried to synthesize it. And there were some people going for the synthesis of hydrastinine at the time, some chemists. And that was an interesting anecdote for me personally, because when I came across the stuff from the Merck archive, which I've gotten out of their archive, is that a guy working 300 meters from the library where I was doing the work, I mean, where I wrote the book, he was Dr. Decker, and he developed a synthesis to synthesize hydrastinine. At first, he offered it to Merck, but at last, he sold it to the Bayer company. So what did Merck say? They say, we want to also be on the market with hydrostenine, so we are in need of another way of synthesizing it. And they made a few attempts to synthesize it by another way, kind of circumventing the old patent by Decker and Bayer. 2 times it did not work out because the patent bureau said it's too similar, we don't accept it. And then they made a big detour through MDMA and similar agents to come to hydrostenine. And that is the reason. So it was an intermediary product of a detour to circumvent a patent. MDMA was the intermediate, and it was not synthesized for itself, it was just in the process. But at that time, if you do a patent on your way of synthesizing things, and then you automatically patent all the intermediates, right? And that was the origin of that patent. So interestingly enough, Merck edited a yearbook, Erich Merck in Darmstadt, and they interestingly resynthesized MDMA because they tried to find another way to an hydrostenine derivative. So they did a second patent in 1920. And in 1927, we don't really know the context, but it was resynthesized again and tested on a vascular muscle, on a petri dish, so to say. It might have been true that at that time they had discovered adrenaline, and so they registered that if you have very low blood pressure, an adrenaline-like agent might help you. And so they tried to develop such a thing, and that might have been the context of that test, but that's not for sure. In 1952, they tested it on flies. Some were fainting, so ohnmächtig, and some others were dying from it, but we don't know what that experiment was good for. And there was a so-called study card in the archives that they resynthesized it again in 1959, but it was suggested by the archivars there that it might have been in the context of finding stimulants for jet fighter pilots so that they can stay awake for a longer time. But that's not sure because we just have that card left. But it seems that they resynthesized it a few times, so there was some interest generated for whatever reason, maybe out of very different contexts. Yeah, but they never made use of it, they never patented it or anything else, like as a substance itself, as a medication or something. So these are all rumors. So MDMA in the military is a separate story because mescaline, MDA, which is kind of a similar substance in respect to its effect in between MDMA and mescaline. So it has some hallucinogenic properties, but also some entactogenic properties. And we have studied that, and we have found that the so-called truth drug research was the main focus of these guys in the past after the physician, the American physician Robert House, he made the following discovery. Giving birth can be a very painful endeavor. And so the Americans, with their better living through chemistry, they came up with the idea, okay, let's inject the women with a substance which ruins your memory for these few hours. Yeah, which was scopolamine, very similar to atropine from Tolkirche, you know, and this gives you heavy mnestic disturbances, so they don't remember the birth anymore. That was their idea. However, they put that person together with morphine and scopolamine in a kind of twilight state, you know, so that they don't register, they're not painful, they don't remember and stuff like that. That was their idea about it. But what they found is that Robert House was doing that, and the female treated was in a kind of twilight state, and then he asked where the baby scale, is that right, scale, the thing where you weight the baby, where it is in the house. And the guy, her husband, had no idea, but she came up with a trunks-like instruction where it is and stuff. And he said, okay, if the will is kind of minimized, then some things might come out involuntarily. And so they came up with the idea, okay, if we have criminals and could put their willpower or minimize their willpower, they will come out with confessions, for example. So that was the beginning of the truth drug research. Later on, it was found in the context of the military that some soldiers which have been suffering from PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder in the First World War, they have been treated with barbiturates because they also kind of dumped down the cortex activity, but not the lower centers as much. And so they came out with memories which they couldn't have access to in their usual conscious state. So it was called narco-analysis and helped some of these post-traumatically damaged people. And so we have known how to how should I say, how to minimize willpower in respect to what you talk about and stuff like that. And Kurt Behringer, the main mescaline researcher in Germany, as well as Heinrich Klüver, a German person living in the US and doing mescaline research, they made kind of similar statements like, oh, if they are under the influence of mescaline, they talk about being homosexual, which was quite unusual at the time, and coming out with things which you usually don't offer to the auditorium, so to say. And this brought up the idea by the Nazi scientists to use these substances to extract information from agents or soldiers from the other side, so to say. So they did this kind of research in the concentration camps, in fact, on a small scale. However, the US Army was also eager to find these things. They found the written material from the Nazis, and they also had the problem that some jet fighter pilots which have been shot down in Korea claimed that the Americans were using biological weapons against Korea. And it seems today that that might have been true, but at the point in time they said they have been brainwashed. And so we have to find out about brainwashing. What did they do with them? If they confess that we have done illegal things and stuff, it's a lie, but you know, they must have been manipulated that way. And we have to find out how people can be manipulated to find measures against it, but also to manipulate ourselves, these people. And this is a mind control research known as MK Ultra in the US. And they tested first off mescaline because they have known that from the Nazi scientists that might be an option. But what they have found is that the mescaline itself gave too much hallucinatory activity and too much mental confusion. So they can't really figure out, they can't understand their questions and stuff like that. So they get too irritated. So they came up with the idea, okay, let's find something which is a little bit more in the direction of amphetamine and leaves you with a more clear mind and not so much confusing mental irritation. And it was a search for more specific drugs to manipulate people. And there have been tests of these kind of drugs at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, which was an official public institution, and they injected psychotherapy and psychiatric patients without their knowledge with these kind of substances. And what happened is that one person was even dying from it because they got a 10-fold overdose intravenously of MDA. And later on it came out, they covered that case up, obviously, Secret Service, blah, blah, blah. But it came out that their testing of the substance was looking out for the LD50. This means the lethal dose where 50% of your experimental animal will die from. You know, do you know how the military did that? They intoxicated 2 rats. When one was dying, that was the LD50. Usually you have 40 or 100 or something to really calculate that. So they did that so roughly that it became necessary from even their mind to do an animal toxicology study in the usual format how you test medications for human use appropriately. And so they did some animal toxicology study at the University of, what was it? I don't know. I think in Michigan. And they tested MDA, they have known that might be toxic to humans. They tested MDE and also MDMA in these animal tox studies. And that guy is Gordon Ellis. He is the discoverer of the psychoactive effects of amphetamine and of MDA. And he was also having a research contact with the secret CIA research about MDA and MMDA. Yeah, we have really gone into that stuff and tried to find out about it in detail in our publication here. And what was their conclusions about these kind of things? They covered up that death case, obviously. They did these animal toxicology tests, but at that point in time, LSD became greater. And LSD, you can spray over a large population because it's active in 1/10 of a milligram, so 1/10,000 of a gram might intoxicate a person. And so they had these fantasies as also odorless and tasteless, so you can easily spray it, or later on in a more realistic scenario, because if you spray it, some people might be in their flat, they don't get anything, and they might be still sober and can act in a different way and stuff. So the more factual, reality-checked idea was put it into an aircraft carrier's water tank, right? So that everybody drinks from it, and everybody's kind of getting crazy. And if you look in the internet at YouTube, if you put in LSD army or LSD military, you will find some spots where these guys go really crazy. At first they follow their commanders, and then they laugh at them and go away, and one guy is climbing up in a tree and talking to the birds and stuff. You know, they are really kind of incapacitated, as they call it, you know, and they try to find a way to do war without shooting and making people die. So it was, in their eyes, quite a legitimate endeavor to find out about that. You just make them unable to do anything for a few hours, and then you go into the city and then it's yours, but you haven't brought anyone to death or produced any injury. That was their idea. However, they tested that in Michigan, I said that. As far as we know, it's not written completely right, as far as we know, there was no operational use of MDMA because they left it because of LSD seemed to be more interesting at that point. These are historical circumstances sometimes determining what's going on. However, a certain guy called Aldous in Porton Down, the Great Britain chemical warfare facility, was synthesizing these kind of things until the mid-1970s. And so there was some research going on, and we don't know about these experiments because the British are even more closed up about it than the Americans. And the CIA and the US Army came to the conclusion we can't do anything for real with these psychoactive drugs in respect to interrogation. We have to torture the people simply by physical means. And that was their paradigm. So they thought they are too confused. They did experiments having healthy volunteers, and they had to keep some things secret, and then they injected them with drugs and tried to interrogate and find out what they have to try to keep secret. And that was so confusing, and the results were, you know, sometimes that way, sometimes true, sometimes not, and so on. And by the way, the physical means didn't help so much anyway, because after the September 9th or what, in 2001, that thing, they tortured them physically, and in retrospect, 10 years later, was an evaluation of that, and they said there was mainly bullshit coming out. And so they tried to give an information to the interrogators, but that was wrong. So they were left alone because they gave the information, but that information was wrong. And so it doesn't make sense. Maybe the whole torture thing doesn't make sense, but the CIA at least officially left that. We don't know what they still do. I don't think that much, because we don't have so much substances which really are different than the ones we know. Therefore, I would not go for it. Okay, however, what happened in the 1960s? There was a Polish couple of chemists which did a new synthesis, which was published in Polish, but also extracted in the so-called chemical abstracts, where they give you an abstract of what happened in Poland, so to say. So there was that thing out there in 1960s. So people which might looking out for underground drugs or illegal drugs might find that recipe and go for it. But however, there's just a very vague evidence that it was synthesized already in the late 1960s. I would tend to not believe in it. But MDA, which is also a substance which has a kind of similar profile, not completely, it's not MDMA, but it's somewhat MDMA, it's called the love drug at the time, and that was very sought after, so means a lot of people want to take it, and so there was a certain production of that stuff, and it became illegal in 1970s, and in 1970, and there might have been attempts to try to circumvent the law and produce stuff similar to MDA, and so it seems that the chemists were looking out for these kinds of derivatives to stay legal and to find an even better kind of drug. We don't know that much about these underground chemists, obviously, at the time, but Alexander Shulgin, some of you may know him, it was a prominent American psychopharmacological chemist, sent an info on request to a guy in the Midwest in 1970s, and it has been seen that the first street sample gathered by the Drug Enforcement Administration in the US was found in Illinois, which is in the middle of the Midwest, in 1970s. So the recreational history seems has begun around 1970s with a few batches found. And there was also another publication, I want to put that too much in the foreground, but this paper is based on a DEA document, what we got hold of, where the DEA has listed all the findings and seizures where they could get hold of MDMA, and that was a really unknown history at the time. And what we see, if we look at all these findings by all the institutions which were involved with detecting new drugs and stuff in the US, you can see that in the Midwest, which is here, Illinois is here, this is Chicago, and this is Tennessee, where the first larger lab was found, and this was in kind of outlaw, so to say, but it seems that it might have been transported to the West, right, at that point, but this is up to 1975. And what we see then is that lab was down there, which I pointed to, and there was another lab in Marin County in California in 1975. That was all before Shulgin really came involved. A lab was found in Boston, and one in Ontario, in Canada, and another lab in San Francisco that might have been connected to Shulgin somewhat, but we are not sure about. And so there is a pre-Shulgin history of that molecule as a recreational drug. However, the DEA did not find that drug interesting because there were just very few complications and just a very few findings or seizures of it. But what you can see here in the later period, it's on the East Coast and the West Coast, right? Not in the Midwest anymore, nothing here, right? And so there is a certain distribution pattern. Usually you see in the US that on the coasts are more new drugs than in the other parts, Kentucky and Trump lands and so on. Yeah, Shulgin's rediscovery was interesting because it didn't happen that way. I was in his lab in the 1990s, and he was having a mescaline experience in 1960 and was so impressed and fascinated that it became his life endeavor to synthesize mescaline derivatives at first, later on other things. And so he came to these substances, found them interesting. And he also synthesized MDMA in 1965. Posthumously, after he died, we found the evidence in his cellar, his old notebook, and so it's proven, meanwhile, what he claimed before just. But he did not take it, interestingly enough, because he took everything, what he synthesized, but not that molecule. Nobody knows why, but that's the truth. He worked together with a Chilean psychiatrist called Claudio Naranjo, because he in Chile could do clinical research without all these regulations and stuff like that. And so they came across that molecule, MDA, and found it useful in psychotherapy. They also came across MMDA and found it useful. But when Shulgin did not test it himself, MDE, which is quite similar to MDMA in its action, he sent it to Naranjo, but he took a very low dose, so he wrote him back no effect. And so they left that branch of inquiry. You know, didn't come across MDMA because of that. But however, Schulgen was informed by a lab colleague, which he had a lab together to synthesize illegal drugs and look for the byproducts, official research. And they produced MDMA, and that guy took it and found it pretty fascinating and told that to Schulgen, but Schulgen shelved it and didn't take it for whatever reason, again. However, he was the rediscoverer because another student informed him that that might be an interesting molecule, and he had a good reaction to it. And then he started his self-experiments, but however, Schulgen was accustomed to these amphetamine-like compounds, and so he found it somewhat interesting, but called it his low-calorie martini because it gives you a kind of social feeling, but he didn't take an appropriate dose, so he had no idea about it. However, he himself claimed later on, oh, he got it, and da-da-da. But if you look at the lab books and what really happened, it wasn't that way. He didn't get it. And so I came back when he was already dement, very nice still, but quite dement. And I came back and I asked his wife, what really happened? And she said, you're right. He didn't get it. He gave it to Leo Zeff, that prominent underground psychotherapist, and then the whole thing took off because he found it very useful in psychotherapeutic procedures, and so he was a real distributor, and Schulgen then backed him. And also he helped physicians to synthesize MDMA. Why was that the case? This is because there is a certain law in America, or in the US, when you, as a physician, if you synthesize the substance yourself, you can use it, even if it's not an approved substance. And so he helped them synthesize it. It wasn't okay if they were just bystanders and look at him doing it. They have to do it themselves. And he gave them advice and let them do it in his laboratory. But it was his role. Then Leo Zeff comes more in the foreground. That guy, he was more the Johnny Appleseed of MDMA in the beginning. And they tried to keep it silent and don't go to the press and pound it out. And they had kind of secret invitation-only meetings at the Esalen Institute, a kind of haven for humanistic psychotherapies. And there was also an organization called Arupa, which is kind of in Buddhist language more something like invisible, but it was in fact called the Association for the Responsible Use of Psychedelic Agents. It was in fact an underground therapist circle which met at Esalen. And there was also an organization founded by a prominent architect, Buckminster Fuller, and that thing was kind of left, this organization, and Rick Doblin and his friends took it over. So they were called at first the Earth Metabolic Design Labs. And they planned studies with MDMA when it was still kind of underground and not known to the broader masses. And they were also preparing later on when some hearings about MDMA were initiated. I will soon come to that. But what happened during that phase? So the so-called Boston group distributed MDMA. They had their own lab. And there was also a certain distribution in Oregon in the recreational drug scene at that point. Then in 1978, the New York scene became knowledgeable of it. In 1978, the first MDMA trip of Timothy Leary was published. Now, he had it earlier, but they made him quiet because this guy could make everybody crazy. Then Claudio Naranjo's Arica project made some use of MDMA, but also in a very secretive fashion. And Robert Fordy, a very early guy in the distribution of MDMA, but they were more kind of having an elitist approach. Let's give it to people which have the knowledge, which are academics, which are like Huxley, you know, they can inspire the masses, but in a more differentiated way than giving it to everybody to dance and stuff like that. So they had this kind of habit. So if you look at the DEA statistics, what happened at that in these years, they had a lot of labs busted in that period. 80% of them were producing amphetamines and PCP, or angel dust phencyclidine, a kind of ketamine-like drug. No MDMA lab was found, but they found 16 labs producing MDA, right? And so the Drug Abuse Warning Network, that was an organization founded in the USA, existed for kind of 30 years. They were looking out for emergency rooms and doctors, which let them know what are the new drugs around, right? But they found complications in these 5 years, 8 on the whole country. So it seems to be a very safe drug at that point. And so they were still not doing anything about it because kind of safe, not very distributed, we don't care. Yeah, Ezeland and MDMA, I've already pointed to that fact. And then there was a significant psychotherapeutic use in around 1980. There were these conferences. Some brochures, underground-wise, and articles were appearing or issued in the lay press, but they still were avoiding media attention at that point. And they also produced the first psychophysiological study, which also has been published in a scientific journal to make sure that this is a safe drug and nobody can say something else, because they did blood pressure measurements and ECG and everything about that. And it seems that was a very mild drug to the organism, so to say. Yeah, I don't want to go too much into it, but George Greer was the pioneer in the psychotherapeutic use of MDMA, together with his wife, a psychiatric nurse. They did very professional papers. The first ones came from them. They were just circulated among serious psychotherapists and not published in official journals. Later on, these articles were even published in scientific journals. And we have also done a study about this early use in psychotherapy. And what has been done is they used it for trauma patients, also for people in life-threatening situations in respect to having a diagnosis of terminal cancer and stuff like that. Psychoneurotic disorders and couples therapy, because if you can dump down anxiety as much as with MDMA, you can communicate much better with each other, especially if you are already in kind of, just throwing bombs at the other, and it might be good if you can hug each other for a while. And we have also seen successful treatments with psychosomatic disorders and also with psychotics, but not with people in a psychosis. It was more these people which experience psychotic disorders sometimes are being very harsh to their relatives, and so they try to use MDMA to milder or attenuate that kind of destructive effect on the interpersonal field. So to say, by putting the psychotic in a non-psychotic phase together with his relatives and moderating that in a therapeutic manner so that they can have a better connection to each other afterwards. There were also some safety measures in these settings we have found. So kind of some indications and contraindications, and also how to handle the MDMA sessions, and that you make a written agreement in advance that the person will not go away during the action of the drug and stuff like that, right? There were, however, some cases of malpractice, and that has been also published in this publication, and I was very afraid that some reviewers might say, oh, what's going on here and stuff, but there have been abuse cases in the past, so everybody who is in power with something tried to abuse it. It's quite a normal thing. Also in usual psychotherapy, you have these sexual abuse cases and stuff, but we had these cases, and a new case happened in 2018 in these trials, gave the main reason why MDMA was not approved for marketing a few months ago by the FDA. Okay, there were also some other articles. This is a very interesting, prominent article with very good factual information, just one page in an underground magazine, which was quite distributed, 100,000 copies. And so the people became aware successively of that. And I just want to mention here these kind of tractates, brochures, all underground. However, what happened in 1978 is that Michael Clegg, a former theology student, became aware of MDMA by an own experience, and he was contacting the Boston group, and so he tried to distribute it a little more, at first as a spiritual device for helping meditation and coming to conclusions with yourself and stuff like that. However, what he found is that some of his admirers became a little bit excited during the MDMA state and began to dance and stuff, let's go for music and stuff, and then they were really going into it, and they found that that is the most natural expression to their eyes. I'm not that much of that opinion. I've used it for tens of years in a therapeutic fashion, and that also worked quite well, but they came to that. And what do the Americans do? If they can sell something, they sell it. And they go really for it, and they found, oh, it can be a party drug, we can sell it in discotheques and stuff like that, and they became very lazy with each other in the discotheques. And so if that a puritanic Texan would see what's going on in that discotheque, you know, they hug each other and they might become even kind of petting and stuff, you know, they don't want that. And so they had this guy, Senator Benson, informed the DEA what's going on in these few discotheques in Dallas and other Texan cities. And so the Texas group was built up, and they produced the stuff, and they said, okay, we'll do it in the US until it will be forbidden. And then they changed to Mexico, produced it there in very large amounts. And then they were going to try to go to Panama. That didn't work out. And then at last they ended up in Brazil and found out that they had an analog act like the US, means every kind of substance which going for that effect is forbidden automatically. And so they kind of, at last he was, that Michael Clegg guy was busted with his whole troop together. But they have distributed millions. However, what happened if you want to prohibit a substance under US law? You have to announce that. If you are the Drug Enforcement Administration, you have to announce that in a certain paper, and the pharmaceutical industry is always looking out for that, what they want to prohibit, because it might be an opiate what we are doing good business with. And so they have to be informed, and they can intervene and ask for a hearing about this process of prohibition, because it might be not appropriate. They have other information and stuff like that. So what happened is, the DEA announced the scheduling, and here you can see the chief of the DEA at the time. But some physicians interfered. They hired a lawyer. They said this substance should not be forbidden, and we are against the prohibition, and we have arguments. And so they had to hold these hearings. In the US, you have usually 3 places where these hearings happen, because it could be a disadvantage if you live in Kansas and the thing is 4,000 miles away. So they have to do it in an appropriate place. That's the usual thing with the pharmaceutical industry too. So they did that, and the so-called administrative law judge of that hearing, it's a law, and it's a judge, I mean, a Richter, but this guy is from the DEA, right? However, this guy was kind of being somewhat objective about the evidence, and the physicians presented some witnesses, and the DEA presented witnesses for their point of view. And what the major issues were, is there a high potential for abuse? Is there a currently accepted medical use in the US? These are standard questions about every kind of medication. Is there a lack of safety under medical supervision? Might it produce hindrances for research if we schedule it? And is it neurotoxic in humans? And these were the answers after the expertises have been heard. High potential for abuse? No, in comparison to opiates and cocaine and so on. Currently accepted as medical use? Yes, they accepted these 30 physicians which have used it in psychotherapy. There's no lack of safety under medical supervision, as we can see today still. Is it a hindrance for research if you schedule it? Yes. And is this neurotoxic for humans? At that point in time, they had just evidence from MDA, which is different, and which is toxic in higher doses, but not MDMA, but they said, legitimately, they said, we have a kind of similar substance, we have found evidence for neurotoxicity, let's stay away from that substance until we know. Okay, but it wasn't sure that it is neurotoxic. There were other evidence that it is not neurotoxic, but so they couldn't say. However, the judge's decision, it shouldn't be in Schedule 1. She was quite objective. It should be in Schedule 3, where you can find opiates and amphetamines which have a certain medical use but have to be prescribed under specific circumstances, much more tightened than the usual medications. However, the DEA overruled their own judge's decision, yeah, and did an emergency scheduling of MDMA because it's really necessary, it's damaging people's brain and everything. However, the physicians were doing an appeal, a Berufung, yeah, and were going to another court, and they said, no, what the DEA has done is inappropriate because the arguments behind it are not stable and solid. So we will take that away, that emergency scheduling. It's illegitimate. And so there was a so-called Grinspoon window, because Lester Grinspoon was a Harvard psychiatry professor who did that appeal. And so it was half a year where MDMA was still legal. A lot of the later researchers said, yeah, I took MDMA, but during that period, so that they were legal. Yeah, then we had the following period when it was, the emergency schedule was in place again after that Grinspoon window. But interestingly enough, 2 years later, it became obvious that the so-called general, the Attorney General, Oberstaatsanwalt, has not transferred the authority to do an emergency scheduling to the DEA. So it was invalid. It means all the people which have been busted during these 2 years had to be left free because of illegal doings by the DEA. That's also in the US. However, what followed is in 1986, there was a big MDMA conference, which has been also published in a journal about. Then we had the Zeptir in Switzerland. They had a permit to do MDMA and LSD-assisted psychotherapy in this time period. And in Germany, we had the ECBS, European College for the Study of Consciousness, which lived for kind of 15 years. And people from that research groups did research with mescaline, very modern neuroimaging research. The first neuroimaging studies were done by them, and were a lot of research with MDA and MDMA, MDE and MDMA-like substance. MEPS conducted some conferences, one in Bern and one on the Dead Sea. And Charlie Grob did the first psychophysical study with MDMA. It was a process of 10 years to come through with just one research project in the US. So it was a really hard time. However, what happened is, because of that explosion in Texas, it became known more, and the nightclubs in New York and California and so on. So it became distributed. And also Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, today called Osho, had also took part in the distribution, not as much by intention, but I've told you that in Oregon it was already on the rise in the mid-1970s, and they came in the 1980s, early 1980s, to Oregon and tried to make up a big city over there, and that was stopped by the American laws, and so they had to flee all over the world with the knowledge of MDMA, so they might have done quite a bit of distribution of MDMA during that period in the mid-1980s. For example, it was mainly distributed initially from Ibiza to the UK and so on during these years, and a lot of Osho fans still live on Ibiza, by the way. And so the rave movement began in 1988 in Great Britain mainly. And it has been told to me that MDMA is the antidote to the British mentality. Everybody is, like this. But however, in Switzerland, oh, I'm in Switzerland, right? In Switzerland, they had Samuel Wittmer, a very lazy guy doing not all good things, but some things good, some things not. But later on, I learned to know in a TV show, the chief of the Swiss Psychiatric Society, the highest ranking psychiatrist, and he was looking this is not allowed. it should be not done by anybody. You know, and so I immediately know why Samuel Wittmer has to be there, because these are kind of the opposites, so to say. And then it became a global distribution as a party drug, not really global. We take ourselves also in the center, European-centered approach and blah, blah, blah. But in the industrialized countries at least, but what we see during the last 10 years is quite an explosion in the third world countries. Because to deal a drug is not, you don't need industry for it. You know, it just needs distribution and stuff, and they like it too somewhat for these party purposes mainly. Yeah, and I told you already about this study by Charlie Grob. He also did some imaging, and I just want to go into that because it leads us directly to the toxicity issue. So this was problematic from the beginning onwards because the scheduling was done because of potential neurotoxicity. What happened is that in 2001, they published in this entertaining TV show a fake brain scan from his study. They altered the data in this way. And it means MDMA is producing holes in your brain. They called it, by the way, the Swiss cheese brain. Right? And the interesting thing is, what they did is, so if you take MDMA and we put you in a scanner a few hours after the MDMA effect is over, you have a little bit lower blood flow in some brain regions. Completely undangerous, banal, you don't care about it. But what they did is, all these places where there is a little bit smaller, for a few hours, a little bit smaller blood flow, they made holes out of it. And this is how they produced it. And I especially was impacted because I had an ethical review board submission going on about couples therapy. You know, and my chief was in favor of it, but he called me up when that thing came out and said, it produces holes in the brain, we can't do any study with it. You know, yeah, and there was another scandal, I will come soon to that, which also hindered. This delayed therapeutic research for 10 years. This one image, you know. It's really terrible. What's about all the PTSD patients? I mean, you know. However, so what we can see, I just will give you just one slide about it. All the neurocognitive studies which have been done at first with the MDMA users were having a lot of biases because the researchers were financed to find out about the dangers. For one thing, for example, they gathered people in New York to be tested in San Francisco. Every neurocognitive researcher knows jet lag produces neurocognitive deficits. So they prove that they have neurocognitive deficits because they were jet lagged, but they didn't tell you that, right? We have to find out later on that half of the population were jet lagged. You know, then you can easily find these kind of cognitive deficits, right? So a lot of these studies were biased in that respect, and they produced very variable results. The variability was an advantage because we could say, okay, why are these studies not producing these deficits? Might it be a methodological problem? You know? And what we know today is the main thing what happens is not destruction of cells. It's mainly that your serotonin transporters, if you take it on a chronic basis, 50 pills per year or more, then you might have a dump down of the serotonin transporters. However, they regenerate. And so therefore, it seems to be not that toxic. And there was, beside that fake brain scan, there was another thing going on. One of the leading researchers in the US called George Ricordi at the National Institute of Drug Abuse intoxicated some monkeys with what he thought MDMA. 2 of them were dying. The other ones developed Parkinson's. So he published And I was told today that your chief in the forensic department here was one of the reviewers of that publication before it was published. And he wrote, he told me so, he wrote to Science, that major journal, this can't be MDMA, it's exactly the toxicity of methamphetamine, what you were talking about here. However, they got it published, it came out with MDMA produces Parkinson's disease. You can think about what my chief told me, right? However, the therapeutic researchers were immediately writing to Science and saying exactly the same thing, that can't be true. And they were so intense, and there's also this kind of Freedom of Information Act in the US, so that you can get hold of the results. And they really extracted the results from the researchers, and they said, it can't be true. So let's go to the freezer and defreeze the monkey brains, what your conclusions are built on. And then that researcher, recording himself, found that he had fed them methamphetamine instead of MDMA. So some people have thought, might the CIA has interfered with it or whatever. They have done a lot of examinations about it, how it could be that these bottles were mislabeled, as they called it. And they had to retract the publication, but you know these kind of things. You have big headlines one day, and the next day on page 14 is saying, oh, it wasn't quite true. Yeah, yeah. And so that was also a very big hindrance for MDMA research. However, a lot of studies were permitted after the publication was retracted. However, there was no evidence that anybody got Parkinson's from MDMA. So why do you take this stuff so serious 20 years after MDMA has been used in a recreational context, especially since Texas and the rave movement in quite large amounts? There was nobody having Parkinson's. Why do you believe in that kind of stuff? You know? However, it fitted into this dangerous drug kind of thing, right? Yeah, interestingly enough, there was a German study conducted, financed by the Green and Social Democrat Party. They spent more than 10 million to really do a very comprehensive study and examine everything. So the short version is, they had 5 groups. One completely drug-abstinent group of healthy volunteers, so to say. They had one group doing drugs, but no MDMA. And they had 3 groups of MDMA users. One was taking 50 to 100 pills, cumulative dose over lifetime. The other group was 100 to 500 pills, cumulative dose. And the third group was 500 to 2,500 pills, right? That was done around the year 2000. What they found is that all these parameters, and they've done PET scans, receptor scans, everything, psychopathology, social things, everything, you know. What they found is that the group with 50 to 100 pills didn't show any aberration in any parameter. They were healthy. So, what these fucking researchers did is, if it comes to this report to the government, they have done the groups correctly. If it comes to international journals and publish their results, you know what they did? They put it all MDMA users in one pot. And then under the line, everybody was damaged on average, right? This is scientific fraud, to my eyes. However, Dr. Tomasius gave a talk at one of the conferences where I was, and I raised my finger and I said, Dr. Tomasius, what's about your different groups? Wasn't it true that that one group wasn't having any damage? And he said, oh, Professor Passie, you were right. But you know, I don't tell people that because then I get funny questions. Yeah, that was his answer. Funny questions means that people would ask, oh, 50 pills I can take without any damage? You know, he didn't want that. And these were recreational users doing it often together with other drugs, alcohol, cannabis, benzodiazepines, cocaine, amphetamines, and so on. This was a potential bias anyway, that we might not look at MDMA toxicity, we might look at synergistic toxicity from different drugs. What did we do in Harvard when I was over there as a visiting professor? We did, what's going on here right now? My thing is not working anymore. Oh man, technique, huh? I have no idea. No, it's not. Okay, maybe you can check that.
Turn it off and turn it on.
Turn it off and turn it on, okay. Yeah? Should we give it a try?
What about
I don't know.
Even the
We could go to the next slide, but let me tell the people. Okay, so when we were, the guys in Harvard, they just cook with water, as everybody, but they are pretty intelligent in respect to finding out what's wrong with the usual studies and to make it better. Make it better studies, less biased, less compromised, and so on. So they came up with the idea, our department's chief had that genius idea, okay, let's use the Mormons. Because the Mormons are a Christian kind of sect, and they have a list of substances they don't have to take. And they're usually very strict in that respect. But MDMA wasn't on the list. So they have just done MDMA, and we have verified that by hair analysis, so that they didn't do anything else. So what the outcome of that study was that their neurocognitive functions, even if they were recreational users doing a few hundred pills and stuff like that, they had nothing. And funny enough, all these people which have published studies like ecstasy-induced brain damage and stuff, they were all writing to us. You idiots over there, we are at Harvard, the Temple of Science. You idiots over there, okay. We are the idiots, okay. And we were not the idiots. We were methodologically quite sound. They only found one bias methodological problem, which we were aware of. But we could point to them, you have it 10 times more than we do. And they couldn't find anything really adverse to go against us. But our chief told us, you know what they are anxious about? Not about your results, they were anxious about their money. If it's not dangerous and their study results were kind of fake or very inexact at best, then they might not get money anymore. This is why they were protesting, against us. It must be wrong results, blah, blah, blah. And we have another problem too, right? Or?
Yeah, there's always a problem. But
there's always a problem, okay.
For us,
but now it works here again. Thank you for helping out with that at least. Okay. Okay, that was the Harvard study on the Mormons. And since that time, it has been concluded that MDMA taken just as a sole substance is untoxic. And there's no reason for being afraid of toxic brain damage, especially not in therapeutic context. You might have, if people are dancing all night, don't drink enough, don't eat enough, then they might get overexcited and get problems with it on a bodily level, not on the brain. And if you take too much and too high of a dose and 10 pills after one another and stuff, that might still damage you. If you take, by the way, 10 pills of paracetamol, you need a liver transplant, right? So, if you're an idiot, I can't hinder that. Yeah. And now I don't want to go very much into this. I've put a lot of slides out because it's also a topic I like to talk about. Interestingly enough, there is a commission about abuse, about drug abuse and abused drug in the WHO, So, and this committee was also looking at MDMA. And the chairman said, I don't want to prohibit that until more research has been done in its therapeutic potential. And so the recommendation which they brought out in 1986 was the following. And, a funny anecdote in history is that the chairman of that committee was the brother of Stanislav Grof. Yeah. And it was, they had to, because they are just doing decision in consensus. And the chairman wasn't in consensus. And so they had to find a procedure to handle that. And one outcome was that they stated this, so that really researchers and countries should look into this main potential. What we have done is we did a study on people which have been treated with MDMA but which had not PTSD. They were conventional psychotherapy patients, usually treated 5 to 10 MDMA sessions plus long-term psychotherapy. And we have done a study about them, and we also had a lot of qualitative interviews done with them, and they have been ausgewertet in a scientific fashion so that we could extract a more subjective perspective on the therapeutic process. And this book is out there, it just costs 15 euros still, and it has been found so fascinated by the Americans that they translated it and put it out too as Healing with Intelligence. It's more a kind of general view into MDMA psychotherapy from the patient's perspective, so to say, but there's also some stuff around the neurobiological and psychological processes which we have found. I don't want to go too much into these details, just one slide about them. What we have found in their reports is that there was a very deep psychophysiological relaxation. A lot of patients were reporting, I was never relaxed so much in my whole life, and that could help psychotherapeutic processing. There was an opening up, so they were much more open to talk about their problems, and there was also a significant decrease of anxiety. There is a very nice German word about this, which is Entängstigung. Entängstigung. Yeah? And that's a major feature of MDMA in respect to the therapeutic capabilities. And there is an altruist experience of the body. You feel much more one with your body, so to say. Mind, feeling, and body are not as separated as usual. And the major factor, this is a result of our study, the main thing is you get more trust, especially if you have been damaged, let's say by torture or by a rape or by being mistreated and so on. So it's not so much the reprocessing of traumatic events. I will give you a scheme about that too, but it's mainly about trust building. And it seems that even people which have been traumatized for quite a while could very much profit from this expansion of trust, so to say. And there were also so-called age regressions where people were able to go back in their past and experience situations in a very real way and to simulate these situations as well as behave differently in the scenarios. We had one woman there who had been kind of, we shouldn't say that, but tyrannized by her mother, coming in once in a while, without knocking on the door and being in the room and controlling her, whatever, when she was kind of 10, 12 years old. And in the imagined scenario, she was throwing her out. Go out of here! Like what she never did in her past. These kind of re-scripting situations somewhat was also going on. Yeah, what was the mechanisms of actions as far as we found? An activation of emotions. There is a problem with MDMA somewhat because it's too euphoric. MDE gives you a much broader spectrum of emotions. It's not just euphoria, it's also problematic feelings, sadness, anger, grief, etc. There is a certain reprocessing of traumatic events. I will go into that a little bit with a scheme in a while. There is a speeding up of intra-psychological processes, so the people are much more into their psychological issue and can clear up things inside. There's also a kind of de-schematizing, we have called it that way, so that you usually have a certain scheme about things. For example, with another woman who was angry her whole life that the parents get separated when she was 8 years old. Was always against her parents and hate them for that and stuff like that. And during the MDMA-induced state, she became so relaxed that her schema about the situation was altered. And she realized that was the best thing they could do. That they could have done, right? And so these kind of things, and new validations, so they validated the situation in a completely different way. And we also see a transparency of transference phenomena. So if you have a very bad attitude about your dad or something, you might realize that much more so when you are in that kind of state, but you still have anxiety about that person, you know, but you realize, oh, what's going on in me here? Because it seems to be completely inappropriate, because you're not in your scheme. Every boy in that, or every male in that age range is a potential danger, or was bad to you, or something like that, what we call transference in mainly psychoanalytic interpretations. And what is also very important are these corrective interpersonal experiences, so that if, for example, I remember one patient who was always lying on the couch that way, you know, like I would beat him, you know. I didn't do these things, you know, but he was anxious about his father who beat him so often, you know. And he, for example, under the influence of MDMA, became very relaxed, you know, and realized, oh man, that was such a nice therapist, you know, why I'm anxious about it. It's completely inappropriate, but, you know, you couldn't discuss that before with him. He would say, I'm not that way, and, you know, but he wasn't that way, obviously. And so these kind of corrective interpersonal experiences can happen during these kind of states very easily. And I just want to give you a rough sketch about how to reprocess, or how MDMA can help you reprocess trauma. So what's a trauma? A trauma, according to Freud, still the most valid definition, is if your psychological system is overwhelmed by an experience which you are not able to handle with your usual psychological capabilities. An example, if an emergency doctor is informed, over there on the highway there was a heavy accident and some people are injured and one is in the car and just half the body is there and stuff like that. So he is accustomed to that situation. He might go over there and register and just formally do the things what are appropriate. He's not traumatized. But a colleague of mine was part of that scenario, for real, it's a real example, and he was kind of being in that accident in the traffic jam, and was running, because I'm a physician, he was that kind of guy, I'm a physician, I can help, you know, and he was running over there, finding the husband, I guess the driver, of the car, having in his hand the arm of his wife, just the arm, and trying to put the ring off. You know, and he got so traumatized by that scenery because he had no idea about it. He wouldn't know what's going on. Maybe it's just the tire is destroyed or something like that. No, he was completely traumatized. I just want to give you an example. He was completely overwhelmed. What happened is this memory was stored unsorted. You know, it was immediately stored, not sorted through the cortex, so to say. I will go into that and by this scheme here. So if you have a certain visual impression, it usually goes through the eyes to the occipital cortex, and then it will be sent to the thalamus, the so-called relay station in the brain, to be checked about its significance. You do this right now, you know, by checking what's worth remembering and what's not, and what is not as much important, and so on. So you sort out the experience, what you make visually as well as acoustically. So your cortex is asked, is that a significant thing? Should I be aware of it? Should I memorize it? And so on. So you come back with that information through the thalamus and say, okay, let's store it in the hippocampus, in my memory bank. Yeah? What happens if you get a traumatic event or experience a traumatic event, you get that impression, it goes to the thalamus, but goes immediately into the hippocampus. So you have no choice to sort out what's going on with that memory and what you want from the memory and what not and stuff like that. And that might be true, and I give you an example. Yeah, I realize that. But I can't do anything about it, and I want to be out of that because of technical reasons here. However, you got that unsorted memory in your memory bank, and what is an evidence for it is how does that memory come up? If your ego is weakened in the sleep, you get nightmares, being in the same scenario again, holistically, because you were not able to sort it out and just have some features of it in your mind, you have the whole thing, and flashbacks. When you get another kind of traffic jam, you know, maybe there. immediately, and you get also an holistic experience because you have not sorted it out and stored it appropriately, so to say. Okay, usually what happens is that you have a kind of what we call a memory system full of tensions, which is eager to express itself in nightmares, in these kind of flashbacks, and so on, because it has been stored inappropriately. And usually it tries to come out here, and come to your mind, but your amygdala, your fear center, can we do something about it, or?
Yeah, we cannot hear you. I think
Yeah.
we can this part. But can we try with
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, so usually you don't want to remember that thing, right? So your fear center, the amygdala or Mandelkern, helps you to suppress your memory. So if you take MDMA, the main neurobiological effect of MDMA, so Entängstigung, which was a clinical finding at first, comes in again because they have shown that it deactivates the amygdala in the left hemisphere. Not so much that you run into cars and stuff like that, it's very smooth, but it's deactivating. And that means that here you can see that in a picture, in a PET scan, which gives you the metabolic activity. Orange is high activity, the other is low activity, lower is yellow, even lower is blue, and virtually no activity is black. And what you can see here is where the amygdala, or in the left hemisphere, is located, the activity is much lower. And that means, if we come back to our model, that there's another effect too, which is it strengthens the prefrontal cortex, which is also having an influence on the amygdala and its activity. So you get that thing strengthened, and here, that's what, and the amygdala is deactivated. What happens if you have that tensionful memory system in your hippocampus? It automatically, kind of, in a very smooth fashion, easy to metabolize way, it goes up the memory, goes through the thalamus and to the cortex, this time in a very appropriate, smooth, safe environment if you have a good therapeutic condition around, and then it will be stored appropriately in your hippocampus in the right way, and not in this traumatizing way which leaves you with the tension and the anxiety potential and all that, and the higher arousal and so on. That is one of the principles behind MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. However, we have also other mechanisms at work, which are the hormones, which have an influence on learning processes, which you might go through during an MDMA-induced state in a therapeutic environment. There is a release of cortisol and norepinephrine, noradrenaline, which triggers emotional learning. That's also good for the therapeutic process, including fear extinction, Löschung of Furcht, of furchtsame Erinnerung. Yeah? And also cortisol enhances extinction learning. And that has been proven, and MDMA exactly increases these hormones. And so therefore, it is pretty interesting that we have a drug which is what we usually do in psychotherapy. We strengthen the prefrontal functions so that the person can handle their emotions and their anxieties better and the traumatic events. So we have three components. We activate the prefrontal cortex to dump down the amygdala activity and kind of control it better during the MDMA-induced state, not afterwards as much, but you deactivate the amygdala and therefore can reprocess and integrate these traumatic experiences in the past. And we have also an activation of prolactin and oxytocin, which both help you to encode corrective emotional interpersonal experiences, or encoding positive relationship experiences. And at the same time, we have cortisol and noradrenaline, which help you to learn these things and also to help you with extincting bad memories. And these things taken together make a really potent therapeutic drug. However, the pharmacologists are very puristic. They want to have a drug which is just activating 5-HT2A receptors to 50%. So they called our drug a dirty drug, because it goes on different receptors, does different things here, release, there, release, da, 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 you know. However, in 2012, he published an article where we tried to defend this dirty drug because it induces a brain matrix, especially good for healing. Meanwhile, the pharmacologists have changed their mind. They talk about pharmacologically rich drugs. Yeah, it's really true. And so, you know, and this drug especially, I think it's really potent as a psychotherapy, for psychotherapy for assisting psychotherapy. We really have to be very careful, because right now, in general, we are on the completely wrong track to my eyes, because the pharmacologists and these neurobiologists, they suggest to you, yeah, you shuffle your brain around 1-2 sessions and then you're freed from alcoholism. You don't. You need psychotherapy. You might need a little less. It might become more intensive. You might be able to treat some treatment-resistant patients, but you still need quite a process. You need Behutsamkeit, you need Geduld, you know, patience, you know, sensitivity, carefulness, and all that. And you can't do that with 1-2 sessions and blah. The FDA likes that because they say, we are not zuständig für Psychotherapy. You know, we are just for the drugs. And so if you want to get their permit, don't go on with psychotherapy. But here we have a genius combination of these two things. What is bad with that? It's just bad that these guys don't know about it. So they have to expand their awareness about these things. That's the solution, and not that we try to minimize the context of using these substances as abuse, in a way, and suggesting to people that it will work. And then the most methodologically sound studies about MDMA, about psilocybin and the treatment of depression has been conducted in Germany, because it was non-commercial, financed by the government, and they have found that 6 weeks after psilocybin, everything is gone. So if you don't embed that in a long-term psychotherapeutic process, you will be left with nothing after a few weeks. And that's not what we want. Yeah, and then there was a first study, and the results are conformed to the later studies done, so it was a kind of equivalent. And what you see here is the placebo, the patient under a placebo. He also gets some lowering of the CAPS score because of the psychotherapy provided, but without MDMA, and these were treatment-resistant patients, so they were hard to treat. And so they had some effect. So we were doing this MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in groups. And we were seeing people cuddling with each other and being very intimate in their communication to each other and everything, and very empathetic and everything and stuff. And I was wondering, why don't they do telephone calls afterwards? Oh, I found you really nice. Couldn't we do some sex together and stuff like that? And yeah, and the people, we couldn't find this guy. We didn't come across sex in our groups, even if we allowed for some body contact and stuff like that. And especially miraculous was to me that the people don't do dating afterwards. Even if they had such a nice connection and stuff, and we were quite close to each other, and I found you really a nice person, and blah, blah, blah. And we never saw couple building. So I was thinking about that and thinking about that and thinking about that. And then it came to my mind, okay, Freud said, you occupy the other, which you are eager to date and maybe make love with. You know, you occupy him with your libido. Libidinöse Besetzung of the other. You know, that was Freud's term. And so that doesn't happen, it seems. So the people were kind of in contact and very intimate and everything, but then it wasn't giving any love in that sense. And so I was thinking about it, and then they did a study at Hannover Medical School, a secret study, interesting, because they don't want to talk to anybody about it. So what they did is they were doing research on couples having sex in a kind of lab room. They made it very agreeable, like a sleeping room, blah, blah, blah. They had a little hole to the other room where they had these cables and blood pickings and stuff like going on. Their results were that 23 out of 24 people taking part in the study had an orgasm during the thing. And what they found is that if you don't have an orgasm during sex, then your prolactin goes down that way. If you have an orgasm, it goes very high. You know, for a while, the so-called refractory period, where you can't get an erection usually, you know, women might make a difference, but usually you are kind of satisfied or something like that. Saturation period, it's also called. Interestingly enough, MDMA does exactly the same. And so then we were doing research into that, and found that the amygdala deactivation is the same in the post-orgasmic state. And if you list the features of the post-orgasmic state and the typical MDMA-induced state, you will find quite a similarity. And so it became evident that MDMA produces a post-orgasmic state, which leads usually to this kind of non-genital body contact, we called it, and it might open up avenues to body-oriented therapies, which we don't think about today, but it could be also because it's really getting non-sexual, so to say, and that's the key element. And interestingly enough, when we published this paper, a lot of the MDMA therapists, for example, Ralph Metzner, a very prominent one, he said, Torsten, you got it. You know, but I put 10 years of idiot thoughts into it until I came to that conclusion. And they did that experiment, and I found that, oh man, that was a clue to it. You know, and it's pretty interesting because nobody is doing research on the post-orgasmic state. Everybody's doing on the excitation phase and on orgasm, but there are 2 papers in the whole literature, the whole medical literature worldwide, which have done research on, and one was ours. You know. And so, yeah, that was also pretty interesting and pretty interesting finding, which also kind of relaxes the ideas that MDMA is giving you a kind of arousal which is going in the sexual direction. That's usually not true. There might be exceptions, who knows, as with everything. Okay, thanks for your attention and that you were so patient with me.